I found pill bottles with my own name on them, hidden in the kitchen cabinet. Alzheimer medication, anxiety pills, sleeping pills. When did I take these? Never that's when. Because my family was trying to convince everyone I was losing my mind. 75-year-old Ruby Johnson was cleaning out her kitchen cabinets when she discovered the hidden pill bottles on the top shelf. There, it was Ruby Johnson Donpezil for Alzheimer disease, Ruby Johnson Ativan for anxiety, Ruby Johnson Ambien for sleep disorders. She had never seen these medications, never taken them, never even heard of half of them, but someone had put them there. Someone was trying to make her family believe she was sick. It all started 6 months earlier when her son Marcus and his wife Valerie decided to move into Ruby's house. We're selling our place, Mom. They had said the economy is rough, rent is too expensive. We want to stay with you just for a couple months, of course. Ruby had agreed. She would do anything to help her family. But a couple months had turned into 6 months, and now they were trying to control every aspect of Ruby's life. At first it was small things. Ruby, Mom, you've been so forgetful lately. Valerie would say maybe you should get a checkup just to be safe. Marcus would agree, Mom. You're getting older. We need to start paying attention to these things. Ruby had initially thought this was normal. She was getting older. Maybe she really was forgetting some things, but then strange things started happening. Her car keys would disappear. Her wallet would turn up in different places. Her phone would be left on silent, like someone was sabotaging her daily life. Then the doctor appointments started. Valerie began taking Ruby to different doctors constantly. Mom, we need to get your condition checked. She would say after every doctor visit. Valerie would speak privately with the physicians while Ruby waited in the exam room. She could hear whispered conversations through the thin walls. She's been very confused lately. Dr. Valerie would say sometimes she doesn't recognize us. She gets agitated easily. Last week. She forgot how to use the stove. We found her trying to turn on the burners with matches. Ruby would listen in shock. She had never done any of those things. She wasn't confused. She recognized everyone perfectly fine. She had been cooking for 50 years without incident, but Valerie was painting a picture of a deteriorating old woman who could no longer take care of herself. The doctors would come back into the room looking at Ruby with pity and concern. Mrs. Johnson, Valerie tells me you've been having some memory issues. How are you feeling today?
Fine. Ruby would answer, I feel perfectly fine.
But that's exactly what someone with early dementia would say. The doctors would respond knowingly. Patients often don't realize they're having problems. That's why family input is so crucial. Ruby began to feel trapped in her own narrative. Valerie was systematically destroying her credibility with medical professionals, with neighbors, with anyone who would listen. Meanwhile, Marcus remained mostly silent, nodding along with whatever his wife said, like a puppet dancing to her tune. The prescription bottles. Ruby found that day told the complete story. Someone had been collecting medications in her name, probably getting them filled and hiding them to create evidence of her supposed mental decline. But who was paying for these prescriptions? Who was authorizing them? And why? Ruby sat down at her kitchen table and examined each bottle more carefully. The prescriptions were all recent within the last 3 months, all from different doctors, all for conditions. She didn't have the pharmacy labels, showed they had been filled at 3 different locations around town, as if someone was trying to avoid detection. She opened her laptop, the one Marcus had bought her for Christmas, saying, Mom, you need to stay connected, and logged into her insurance account. If these prescriptions were legitimate, they would show up in her claims history. There they were, dozens of medical claims for doctor's visits. She barely remembered medications. She had never taken medical tests. She was certain she had never undergone. According to her insurance company, Ruby Johnson was a very sick woman indeed. But the most shocking discovery was yet to come. As she scrolled through the claims, she found something that made her blood run cold. A neuropsychological evaluation performed 2 weeks ago that supposedly confirmed early-stage Alzheimer disease. The report detailed severe cognitive decline, memory loss, and behavioral changes. Ruby had never taken this evaluation, had never even heard of it, but somehow it existed in her medical records with her name on it. Ruby felt a chill run down her spine. This wasn't just about forgetting where she put her keys or being overly concerned about her health. This was systematic medical fraud. Someone was falsifying her medical records, creating a paper trail that would justify declaring her mentally incompetent. She thought about all the legal documents Valerie had been asking her to sign lately. Just updating your emergency contacts, Mom, just making sure everything is current for your doctors. Nothing major. But Ruby realized now that nothing Valerie did was ever nothing major. Ruby walked to her bedroom and opened the filing cabinet where she kept all her important papers: birth certificate, social security card, insurance policies, bank statements, and there it was, a stack of documents she had signed over the past few months without reading carefully because she trusted Valerie to explain them honestly. Power of attorney documents giving Valerie legal authority over Ruby's financial decisions, advance directive forms authorizing Valerie to make medical decisions on Ruby's behalf, living will documents that would allow Valerie to determine the level of care Ruby received if she were declared incompetent. Ruby felt sick to her stomach as she realized the scope of the conspiracy. Valerie hadn't just been trying to convince people that Ruby was sick. She had been methodically building a legal framework that would allow her to control Ruby. But why? What did Valerie gain from having an incompetent mother-in-law? The answer came to Ruby like a lightning bolt. The house Ruby owned, her four-bedroom house in a desirable neighborhood, outright. No mortgage, worth easily $400,000, maybe more. In today's market, if Ruby were declared mentally incompetent, Valerie would have power of attorney over all her financial decisions, including the authority to sell the house. And what better way to justify putting Ruby in a nursing home than medical records showing progressive Alzheimer disease? Ruby sat back in her chair, feeling the full weight of the betrayal. Her own family was trying to steal her life, her independence, her home, and her dignity by convincing the world that she was losing her mind. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had underestimated Ruby Johnson. Ruby had lived through the civil rights movement, had worked as a nurse for 40 years, had raised 3 children, mostly alone, after her husband died young. She had survived poverty, discrimination, heartbreak, and every challenge life had thrown at her. She wasn't about to be defeated by her scheming daughter-in-law and weak-willed son. The next morning, Ruby woke up with a plan. She would continue to pretend she was unaware of what they were doing, while she gathered more evidence and prepared her counterattack. When Valerie knocked on her bedroom door with breakfast in bed, something she had started doing recently as part of her caring daughter-in-law performance, Ruby smiled sweetly. "Oh, Valerie, honey, you don't have to bring me breakfast in bed. I'm not an invalid. I know, Mom, but the doctor said we should monitor your eating habits, make sure you're getting proper nutrition." Valerie replied, setting the tray down. "Which doctor?" Ruby asked innocently. "Dr. Peterson. Remember, we saw him last week. He was very concerned about your cognitive function." Ruby nodded as if she remembered, though she had no recollection of any Dr. Peterson. She ate the breakfast Valerie brought, noting that it tasted slightly bitter, probably from medication crushed into the food, another piece of evidence for her growing case. After Valerie left Ruby, got dressed, and walked to her neighbor's house next door, Mrs. Henderson had lived there for 20 years and would remember Ruby's normal behavior patterns. "Ruby, dear," Mrs. Henderson said, opening her door with surprise, "I was just thinking about you. How are you feeling?" "Why would you ask how I'm feeling?" Ruby replied, "Well, Valerie mentioned that you've been having some health issues, memory problems and such. She seemed very worried about you." "What exactly did she tell you?" Ruby asked, keeping her voice casual. "She said you've been getting confused, forgetting things sometimes, not recognizing family members. She asked if I could keep an eye on you when she and Marcus are at work." Ruby felt her anger rising, but kept her composure. "Mrs. Henderson, I've lived next door to you for 20 years. Have you ever seen me confused or forgetful?" Mrs. Henderson looked uncomfortable now that you mention it. "No, you always seem sharp as a tack to me." Ruby, "That's because I am," Ruby said. "I need to ask you a favor. If Valerie ever tells you anything else about my supposed health problems, would you mind writing it down with the date and time?" "Of course, dear." "But why?" "Because I think my daughter-in-law is lying about my mental state for reasons I don't yet understand, but I'm going to find out." Ruby spent the rest of the week playing the role of the confused elderly woman while secretly gathering evidence. She found more hidden pill bottles in different locations around the house. She discovered printouts of nursing home brochures in Valerie's purse. She even found a notebook where Valerie had been documenting supposed incidents of Ruby's confusion that had never actually happened. The notebook was particularly damning. February 15th, Ruby tried to cook dinner but forgot to turn off the stove. Had to remind her 3 times what she was making. February 20th, Ruby couldn't remember Marcus's name, kept calling him Robert, which was her late husband's name. February 25th, found Ruby trying to go outside in her nightgown at 2 p.m., thought it was morning. None of these events had occurred. Ruby had never done any of these things, but Valerie was creating a fictional record of progressive mental decline. Ruby also discovered that Valerie had been intercepting her mail, particularly anything from banks, insurance companies, or government agencies. Ruby realized she had no idea what her financial situation actually was, because Valerie had been filtering all her important correspondence. That weekend, when Marcus and Valerie went out for dinner, supposedly to discuss Ruby's care options with a specialist, Ruby used the opportunity to call her bank. Mrs. Johnson, the customer service representative said, "We haven't heard from you in months. Your daughter-in-law has been handling all your account inquiries." "What inquiries?" Ruby asked. "Well, she said you authorized her to manage your finances because of your declining health. She's been asking about liquidating some of your investments and transferring funds to accounts she can access more easily." Ruby felt the room spin around her. Valerie had already begun the process of stealing her money, using the fake medical diagnosis as justification. "How much money are we talking about?" Ruby asked. "Well, between your savings, checking, and investment accounts, you're looking at approximately $250,000 plus the equity in your home, of course." Ruby hung up the phone and sat in stunned silence. Valerie wasn't just trying to take her house, she was going after every penny. Ruby had saved over a lifetime of hard work. But Ruby had one advantage. Valerie didn't know that Ruby was aware of the scam, which meant Ruby could plan her response carefully. The next Monday morning, Ruby called her old friend Margaret, who had retired from nursing around the same time. "Margaret, I need your help with something, and it has to stay completely confidential." "Of course, Ruby, what is it?" "I think my daughter-in-law is trying to have me declared mentally incompetent so she can steal my money and property." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "Ruby, that is a very serious accusation." "I know, and I have evidence, lots of it. But I need help figuring out how to stop her without tipping her off, that I know what she's doing." "Meet me for lunch today." Margaret said, "We need to talk about this face to face." At lunch, Ruby laid out everything she had discovered: the fake prescriptions, the falsified medical records, the forged neuropsychological evaluation, the power of attorney documents, the financial inquiries, the fictional incident report. Margaret listened with growing horror. "Ruby, this is elder abuse. It's a federal crime. If you can prove what you're telling me, Valerie could go to prison." "That's what I want," Ruby said. "But I need to be smart about how I handle this. I can just confront her because she'll deny everything and probably accelerate whatever timeline she's working on." Margaret nodded. "You need to document everything, get copies of all those medical records, get a lawyer involved, maybe even get law enforcement involved." "Can you help me?" Ruby asked. "Absolutely," Margaret said. "In fact, I know exactly who you should call." Margaret introduced Ruby to Janet Torres, a private investigator who specialized in elder abuse cases. Janet was a former police detective who had seen every scam in the book. "Mrs. Johnson," Janet said, after reviewing Ruby's evidence, "this is one of the most sophisticated elder abuse schemes I've encountered. Your daughter-in-law has been very thorough." "Too thorough," Ruby replied. "The good news is that thoroughness is going to be her downfall. We've got documentation of fraud, medical identity theft, financial manipulation, and conspiracy." Janet continued, "But we need to be very careful about how we proceed. If she realizes you're onto her, she might accelerate her plans or destroy evidence." "What do you recommend?" Ruby asked. "First, we get you a complete medical evaluation from an independent doctor to establish your actual cognitive function. Then we work with your insurance company to investigate the fraudulent claims. Then we involve law enforcement." "How long will all this take?" Ruby asked. "If we move quickly, maybe 2 weeks." Janet said, "But you have to continue pretending you don't know what's happening. Can you do that?" Ruby smiled for the first time in weeks. "Honey, I've been pretending to be confused for Valerie's benefit for months. I think I can manage 2 more weeks." The next phase of Ruby's counterattack began immediately. Janet arranged for Ruby to see Dr. Williams, an independent neurologist who specialized in cognitive assessment. The appointment was scheduled for a day when Valerie thought Ruby was going to physical therapy. Ruby told Valerie she was visiting Margaret and took an Uber to Dr. Williams' office. Dr. Williams put Ruby through a comprehensive battery of cognitive tests: memory assessment, problem solving, language skills, coordination, everything that would be affected by Alzheimer's disease or dementia. After 3 hours of testing, Dr. Williams sat down with Ruby. "Mrs. Johnson, your cognitive function is completely normal. There's no sign of any neurodegenerative disease, no memory impairment, no confusion, no indication whatsoever that you have Alzheimer's disease or any form of dementia." "So the diagnosis in my medical records is false?" Ruby asked. "Completely false," Dr. Williams replied. "In fact, based on these test results, I'd say your cognitive function is above average for someone your age. Whoever wrote that neuropsychological evaluation either never examined you or deliberately falsified the results." Ruby felt vindicated, but also terrified. If Dr. Williams was right, then Valerie's fraud was even more extensive than she had imagined. Janet Torres had been busy too. She had obtained copies of all the medical records, insurance claims, and prescription data associated with Ruby's case. She had also been investigating Valerie's background. Ruby, Janet said. When they met again, I found some very interesting information about your daughter-in-law. What kind of information? Ruby asked. Valerie Martinez, before she married your son, has been married twice before. Both previous husbands were significantly older, both died under suspicious circumstances, and both left her substantial inheritances. Ruby felt cold fear wash over her. Are you saying I'm saying your daughter-in-law may have done this before, Janet replied, and if she has, she'll be much more dangerous than we initially thought, because she knows how to make this look legitimate. Ruby realized she was dealing with more than just greed. She was dealing with someone who might be a professional predator. Janet continued, we need to move faster than I originally planned. I think Valerie is further along in her timeline than we realize. What makes you say that? Ruby asked. I've been monitoring the financial inquiries about your accounts. She's been asking very specific questions about how quickly funds can be transferred, how to liquidate investments, how to access retirement accounts. These aren't casual inquiries. Ruby, she's preparing to move your money soon. How soon? Ruby asked. Based on the pattern, probably within the next week or two. Janet said once she feels confident that the medical documentation is solid, she'll make her move. Ruby felt panic rising in her chest. What do I do? Tomorrow, we're going to the police. Janet said, and we're going to bring everything we've collected. The next morning, Ruby told Valerie she was going to visit her doctor for a routine checkup. Instead, she met Janet at the police station. Detective Maria Santos listened to Ruby's story, examined the evidence, and shook her head. Mrs. Johnson, this is definitely criminal elder abuse, but building a prosecutable case is going to take time. Time. I might not have, Ruby said, if she moves my money or tries to have me committed to a facility. Detective Santos nodded. That's why we're going to accelerate the investigation. I'm going to contact your insurance company today to report the fraudulent claims. I'm also going to get a warrant for your medical records to document the falsification. What about Valerie Ruby? Ask. We're going to put her under surveillance, starting immediately. If she makes any moves to transfer your funds or file any additional false medical claims, well, be ready to intervene. But the most important thing, Detective Santos continued, is that you have to continue acting normal. If she realizes we're investigating her, she'll either run or escalate her plans. Neither option is good for you. Ruby went home that afternoon and resumed her performance as the confused elderly woman, but now she knew help was coming. That evening, Valerie approached her with papers. Mom, these are just some updated insurance forms. We need your signature to make sure your coverage is current. Ruby looked at the documents. They appeared to be standard insurance paperwork, but she had learned not to trust anything. Valerie presented. Let me read through these first. Ruby said, I want to understand what I'm signing. Oh, Mom, Valerie replied with practiced patience. You don't need to worry about the details. It's just routine paperwork. Ruby smiled sweetly, but insisted, I always read everything before I sign it. That's how your grandfather taught me? Valerie looked frustrated but couldn't argue without seeming suspicious. Ruby spent 20 minutes carefully reading the documents. They were indeed insurance forms, but buried in the fine print was authorization for Valerie to receive copies of all medical records and to make decisions about Ruby's healthcare coverage. This is the beginning of the end. Ruby realized Valerie was positioning herself to control Ruby's medical care completely. I need to think about this. Ruby said, I'll sign them tomorrow. Valerie's frustration was evident, but she forced a smile, of course. Mom, take your time. That night, Ruby called Janet. She's getting ready to make her move. Ruby said the papers she wants me to sign will give her complete control over my medical care. Don't sign anything. Janet said we're almost ready to move. The next morning, Detective Santos called with news. Mrs. Johnson, we have enough evidence to arrest your daughter-in-law, but we want to catch her in the act of attempting to transfer funds or file false documents. Can you stall for one more day? Ruby agreed, but she was running out of excuses for not signing Valerie's papers. That afternoon, Valerie became more insistent. Mom, you really need to sign those insurance forms today. The deadline is tomorrow. What deadline? Ruby asked. For updating your coverage. Valerie replied, if you don't sign by tomorrow, your insurance might be canceled. Ruby knew this was a lie, but she had to continue playing along. Valerie also presented new documents. These are just updates to your power of attorney, nothing major, just making sure I can help you if you have a medical emergency. Ruby recognized this as the moment of truth. If she signed these papers, Valerie would have complete legal control over her life. I want Marcus to look at these first. Ruby said, he's at work. Valerie replied quickly, these really can't wait. Why the rush? Ruby asked innocently. Valerie's composure cracked slightly because the lawyer's office needs them today. Ruby had never heard anything about lawyers, but she nodded as if she understood. Let's wait until Marcus gets home. Ruby said, I want him to explain them to me. Valerie's face showed her frustration, but she couldn't push too hard without raising suspicions. When Marcus came home that evening, he seemed nervous and distracted. Mom Valerie said, you need to sign these papers tonight. Marcus nodded without looking at the documents. Whatever Valerie thinks is best, Mom. Ruby realized that Marcus was either completely under Valerie's control or actively participating in the fraud. Either way, she couldn't count on him for help. I need to use the bathroom, Ruby said, taking the papers with her. Once alone, she quickly photographed all the documents with her phone and sent them to Janet. Then she returned to the living room. These papers are very confusing. Ruby said, can we go over them again tomorrow when I'm feeling more alert? Valerie's patience finally snapped. Mom, you have to sign these tonight. Why, Ruby asked, keeping her voice innocent. Because Valerie started, then caught herself. Because your coverage expires if you don't. Ruby noticed Marcus looking uncomfortable, but he said nothing. Valerie tried a different approach. Mom, you trust me, don't you? I would never do anything to hurt you. I'm just trying to protect you. Ruby looked at this woman who had been systematically destroying her life, manipulating her son, and planning to steal everything she owned. Of course I trust you, dear Ruby said, but these papers make me nervous. I need more time to understand them. Valerie's mask slipped completely fine. She snapped, if you want to lose your insurance coverage because you're too stubborn to trust your own family, that's your choice. She stormed out of the room, leaving Marcus and Ruby alone. Marcus looked miserable. Mom, maybe you should just sign them. Valerie knows about this stuff better than we do. Ruby studied her son, who she had raised, who she had sacrificed for, who was now either betraying her or too weak to protect her. Marcus, she said gently, are you happy? What do you mean, Mom? Are you happy with your life, with your marriage, with the choices you've made? He looked away. I just want what's best for everyone. Mom, Ruby realized that Marcus was as much a victim as she was. Valerie had manipulated him just as thoroughly as she had tried to manipulate everyone else. Marcus, Ruby said, if I asked you to choose between me and Valerie, what would you do? Mom, he said uncomfortably, why would you ask me that? Because Ruby replied, sometimes in life, you have to choose between right and wrong, and the people you love might be on different sides. Before Marcus could answer, Valerie returned to the room, looking composed again. Mom, she said sweetly, I've been thinking about this all wrong. You shouldn't feel pressured to sign anything you're not comfortable with. Ruby was immediately suspicious. Valerie never backed down from anything. Thank you, dear Ruby, said cautiously. In fact, Valerie continued, maybe we should take you to see Dr. Peterson tomorrow. He can explain these documents better than I can. Ruby knew this was a trap. Dr. Peterson, whoever he was, would probably tell her she was too confused to understand legal documents and needed Valerie to handle everything. That sounds wonderful, Ruby said. The next morning, Valerie was unusually cheerful as she helped Ruby get dressed for the doctor appointment. The car ride was tense. Ruby knew this was probably her last chance to escape whatever Valerie had planned, but she also knew Janet and Detective Santos were monitoring the situation. They arrived at a medical building Ruby had never seen before. Dr. Peterson's office was on the third floor. But when they got there, the waiting room was empty. Dr. Peterson will see you right away, Valerie said. A man in a white coat appeared. He looked more like a businessman than a doctor. Mrs. Johnson, he said, I'm Dr. Peterson. We've met before, though. You might not remember. Ruby was certain she had never seen this man before in her life. Dr. Peterson led them into an examination room that looked more like an office than a medical facility. Mrs. Johnson, Valerie has been very concerned about your cognitive decline. What cognitive decline? Ruby asked. The doctor looked at Valerie, who nodded slightly. Mrs. Johnson, your recent tests show significant memory loss, confusion, and inability to make rational decisions about your care. Ruby realized this was the moment Valerie had been building toward. Dr. Peterson was going to declare her incompetent on the spot. I feel fine, Ruby said. That's exactly what patients with your condition say. Dr. Peterson replied, you lack insight into your impairment, which is why your family needs to make decisions for you. Ruby looked around the room. There were no medical certificates on the walls, no diplomas, no evidence that this man was actually a doctor. Are you a real doctor? Ruby asked. Mrs. Johnson, your paranoia is another symptom of your condition. Dr. Peterson said. At that moment, Ruby's phone buzzed with a text message from Janet. We are outside with police. Do not sign anything. Ruby felt a surge of relief and confidence. Dr. Peterson, she said, I don't believe you are a real doctor, and I don't believe this is a real medical office. Mrs. Johnson Valerie said sharply, you're being paranoid and disrespectful. Ruby stood up. I want to leave now. You can leave, Valerie said, grabbing Ruby's arm. You're not competent to make that decision. That's when Ruby heard the most beautiful sound in the world. Footsteps in the hallway, and Detective Santos' voice calling out police. The door burst open, and Detective Santos entered with two other officers. Ruby Johnson, step away from these people. Ruby had never been happier to see law enforcement in her life. Valerie Martinez, you are under arrest for elder abuse, fraud, and conspiracy. Valerie's face went white. What, this is ridiculous. Detective Santos continued reading Valerie her rights while the fake Dr. Peterson tried to slip out the back door where another officer was waiting. Marcus stood frozen in shock as he watched his wife being handcuffed. Mom, he said, what is happening? Ruby looked at her son, who was finally seeing the truth. Marcus, she said, your wife has been trying to steal my money and property by convincing everyone I have Alzheimer's disease. That's not true. Valerie screamed from the back of the police car. She's confused. She doesn't know what she's saying. Detective Santos approached Ruby with a smile. Mrs. Johnson, are you ready to go home? To my real home? Ruby asked. Yes, Detective Santos replied, your real home that you own free and clear with your real medical records that show you are perfectly healthy. As they drove away from the fake medical office, Ruby felt a mixture of relief, triumph, and sadness. Relief that the nightmare was over, triumph that she had outsmarted Valerie, and sadness that her own family had betrayed her so completely. The legal proceedings took months. Valerie was charged with multiple felonies, including elder abuse, insurance fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. The fake Dr. Peterson, whose real name was Harold Fish, was actually Valerie's cousin and a convicted con artist. Marcus was not charged with any crimes. Detective Santos determined he had been manipulated by Valerie rather than actively participating in the fraud. But Ruby's relationship with her son was permanently damaged. During the trial, Ruby learned the full scope of Valerie's crimes. She had indeed been married twice before. Both husbands had died under mysterious circumstances. Both had left her substantial inheritances that she had quickly spent before moving on to her next victim. Ruby testified at the trial, her voice steady and clear as she described the months of manipulation and fraud. Your Honor, she said on the witness stand, I am 75 years old, but my mind is sharp, my memory is perfect, and my judgment is sound. My daughter-in-law tried to steal my independence, my dignity, and my life savings by convincing the world I was losing my mind, but the only person who lost their mind was her. When she thought she could outsmart this old woman, Valerie was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. Harold Fish received 5 years as an accomplice. After the trial, Ruby sold her house and moved to a smaller place closer to Margaret. She never spoke to Marcus again, despite his attempts to reconcile. Sitting in her new kitchen one morning, 6 months after the trial, Ruby reflected on everything that had happened. She had nearly lost everything to someone she had trusted and welcomed into her family, but she had fought back and won. Margaret visited that day, bringing coffee and gossip from the old neighborhood. How are you feeling, Ruby? She asked. Stronger than ever. Ruby replied, I learned something important through all of this. What's that? Margaret asked. I learned that quiet doesn't mean weak, that being old doesn't mean being helpless, and that trusting people doesn't mean you have to be stupid about it. Margaret laughed. You've always been the strongest person I know. Ruby, maybe Ruby said, but now I know it too. Ruby kept the fake pill bottles as a reminder of how close she had come to losing everything. They sat on her kitchen counter next to a framed newspaper article about Valerie's conviction. Anyone who visited Ruby's new home would see those pill bottles and ask about them, and Ruby would tell them the whole story about how her daughter-in-law tried to drive her crazy for money and how she fought back. Young women especially would listen with wide eyes and ask how she found the strength to resist. To resist. Ruby would smile and say, child, when you get to be my age, you realize that everything you have worth protecting was earned through struggle and sacrifice. You don't just hand it over to someone because they smile sweetly and call you family. You make them prove they deserve your trust. And if they try to take what belongs to you by making you doubt your own mind, well, that's when you show them that this old woman still has all her faculties, including the ability to fight back. The fake pill bottles became Ruby's symbol of victory, a reminder that she had faced down a sophisticated criminal who had underestimated the sharp mind hidden behind her kind face. As Ruby often told visitors to her home, Valerie thought she was dealing with a confused old woman who could be easily manipulated, but what she actually found was a 75-year-old survivor who had lived through too much to be broken by a lying, scheming daughter-in-law with dollar signs in her eyes. The pills were fake, but Ruby S.'s strength was real, and that strength had saved her life, her home, and her independence, proving once again that quiet doesn't mean weak. It just means you choose your battles carefully and fight to win.